Good afternoon, friends, family, and colleagues from across the seas. Once again, this is Dan Diker from Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, together with my esteemed colleagues and friends, Professor Richard Landis, formerly a professor at Boston University and now full-time in the state of Israel in his early years, and really one of the great experts in disinformation in what we know as Pallywood, fake news, which is an incredibly present and important part of this entire war opposite the Iran-driven Hamas-Hezbollah axis. And my dear colleague and friend, Lieutenant Colonel Reserve Maurice Hirsch. We are in day 33, I believe, of the war against the Iranian-backed Hezbollah-Hamas axis. And I'm going to turn to you, Maurice, just for a very quick update before we get into a deep discussion, which we've been having with Professor Landis for many years, since actually the establishment of the Oslo, or the founding of the Oslo Accords back in 1993, and then affirmed in Oslo Interim Accord 1995, about the whole notion of Pallywood, fake news, disinformation, deception operations. It's been a very important part not only of the Hamas operation, but actually of the whole PLO strategy and the Fatah implementation of that strategy. Maurice, how about a quick update as to where we are today? Welcome to all of our friends and colleagues from across the seas to this what we call daily Zoom alert, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, context, perspective, and analysis that we bring you uniquely every single day, and we will continue with you every single day. Go ahead.
So really, Dan, from yesterday, there isn't much different going on. We're still talking about the IDF ground operation in Gaza, where now the forces, as we know, have completely surrounded Gaza City from the south and the north and the east, and they're now just closing in on that central stronghold of Hamas. Hamas, from its part, continues on, even shooting rockets, even in the face of what they call the humanitarian crisis. It doesn't stop them. Food may be running out, but rockets are not, actually quite paradoxically. But that's the situation that we're in those areas. The forces constantly discovering more and more missile shooting areas from within the urban areas, from schools, from playgrounds, from everything else that we've seen all the way along. We're also seeing the movement today, really a mass movement from Gaza City down Salah ad-Din, down that main road, coming out of Gaza City, doing exactly what the Israeli government asked the Palestinian population to do.
You're seeing a very large flow of thousands of Palestinians moving safely through a corridor, a humanitarian corridor, if you will.
Today, they are moving safely down that corridor after yesterday. I believe that yesterday was really a threshold point in that whole event, when the IDF actually placed tanks on that road in order to prevent Hamas from shooting the Palestinians who were fleeing. So I think today the Palestinians feel much safer that the IDF is there to defend them from Hamas, and therefore they're fleeing really en masse, as really suits and is good for Israel's war effort against Hamas. We're not targeting the civilians, we're targeting the terrorists. So that's on that front. On the northern front, Hezbollah, we're still fighting back and forward, tit for tat all the time, missiles being shot into Israel, Israel responding and killing the terrorists there. Judea and Samaria, no change from yesterday. Very tense, still lots of attempts to carry out terrorist attacks by Hamas and the other terrorist organizations, but with limited success. Unfortunately, we've seen a few deaths there as well. And in Jerusalem and in Israel, relative calm has been maintained there. So that's really the situation update. As we just as a prequel to Professor Landis, I was just asked on one of the groups that I'm in as to whether journalists who are propagandists for Hamas can be targeted as legitimate military targets. That's not an easy question to answer. On the one side of the spectrum, you have people like Julius Streicher and Hans Fritzer, who were the Nazi propagandists, put on trial. Julius Streicher was found guilty of crimes against humanity and eventually hung for his participation in in the propaganda and in pushing on and inciting murder. Fritze was acquitted by the Nuremberg trials, but was later grouped in that class 1 of Nazi terrorists for the denazification court, and was convicted for his part in the Nazi.
I think we have just to be fair, I think we have a completely different situation here, where we have in international media. I'm not talking about social networks. What did I do? We lost the screen.
We're here. I think that. I think Dan.
Okay.
I think Dan. I'm not trying to make that exact comparison. I'm just saying that propagandists in and of themselves are not necessarily devoid of any criminal responsibility. They can, I would believe, in certain circumstances, even be targeted as legitimate targeted. Specifically, when we're talking, as I believe Professor Landis will explain, when you're talking about a terror war, where an integral part, really a main part of that effort is propaganda, I think it poses an interesting question. We'll leave it unopened and give over.
Yeah, I want to be very clear here. We're not talking about members of a Nazi party who are propagandists. You're making the claim here, and it's not an unfounded claim, that many independent or major affiliated journalists are reporting incorrectly, are reporting what we say in Hebrew, migamati, meaning they have a particular agenda. They're agenda driven, but we are not suggesting, you're not suggesting that they are legitimate military targets.
So let me just clarify that again. We're talking about, can you target Hamas journalists, people who are members of Hamas, but their position in that terror organization is to be a propagandist. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about journalists from CNN who have their own agenda.
That's very important to clarify.
And they're simply trying to push that anti-Israel agenda.
Right.
That's different from someone who is a member of the terrorist organization and is in that position. His job is to be a propagandist. We saw, for example, Israel in 2018, if you remember the war in 2018, Israel targeted the Al-Aqsa television station, Hamas television station. Right. That was an integral part.
We also targeted Al-Manar. We targeted the Hezbollah television.
So television and journalists aren't necessarily outside of that entire scope, but it depends on exactly what their position is.
That to be very clear.
Propagandists,
the Ramallah Lynch.
Propagandists, for example, propagandists themselves who aren't journalists, but they're just propagandists. They have an interesting position, and that has to be
that's to be very clear that you're talking about members of the Hamas machine. That's very important.
Members of the Hamas machine.
Okay, that's different. That's different. That's a whole different kettle of fish. And again, just to use another worn cliche, as long as we're using cliches, the elephant in the room in our discussion, we're going to turn to Professor Landis right now, is the ceasefire, the increasing demands for what Secretary of State Blinken and as well as President Biden are calling the humanitarian pause.
Right.
That is, we know it as
that is entirely focused one-sided, only on Israel to stop firing to allow Hamas to regroup. But there's no claim to even have any influence over Hamas to say, well, you know what, as part of that ceasefire, you should be releasing hostages.
All of them.
It's entirely one-sided.
So we want to discuss
that.
We want to discuss
that immoral.
We want to discuss why, in our view, at JCPA, the ceasefire is a dangerous, counterproductive development. If one is interested in locating these child hostages. And women hostages and senior citizen hostages in total contravention to international law, humanitarian law, and customary law, as you know, as an international lawyer. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. Let's
so there's 35 children, of them 10 under the age of 5, and the 18 of the hostages who are over the age of 75 on those two scopes.
Yeah, that's right. So, Professor Landis, it's a great honor to have you with us here again at JCPA. You're a regular scholar and contributor to our work here, and it's really great to have you here. As I remember, Professor Landis, you were, I would say, an outstanding voice of moral clarity back in 2000-2001, when the Muhammad al-Dura issue, that was an issue of what we called Pallywood, emerged, which is all part of the Soviet and Nazi-driven and Islamist actually inspired disinformation campaign that went along with the Oslo, what the so-called Oslo peace process was. That strategy has now been wholly adopted by the Hamas, which is not self-evident, because the Hamas was not working on this level of, I think, Iranian regime sanctioned disinformation, a lot of which, by the way, they inherited from Yasser Arafat. They inherited it from the declarations and the strategy and tactics of Mahmoud Abbas and the PA. And here we have it being used day in and day out. Professor wanted to talk about the hospital issue as a case study, perhaps, or an immediate example of this disinformation Pallywood.
All right, so thank you. Let me just say two things. One, you said back in '93, I only got involved in the Al-Dura affair in 2003. I mean, I was already concerned about what was going on, stunned by the coverage of what they called Al-Aqsa Intifada, what I call the Oslo Jihad, starting in end of September 2000. But it was in 2003 that I first got involved in the Al-Dura affair, and I saw some of the footage in Paris. And then I came here, worked with Nachum Shachaf, saw 2 hours of footage from an Arab cameraman who worked for Reuters, who had sent his stuff to Shachaf in his investigation, and then had the horrifying experience of watching the actual 20 or so minutes of footage taken by Charles Anderlin, France 2's cameraman, Talal Abu Rahma, in Netzarim Junction, which ends with 60 seconds of alleged targeting of the boy by the Israelis. And while I'm watching it, I had already been trained by Shachaf to notice all the staging that went on.
And Shachaf was a physicist, just to remind our audience, right? He was a physicist.
He still is.
He's thank God, he's a physicist, and he was the first scientist to say that from a scientific standpoint, it was impossible for Muhammad al-Dura to have been killed by Israeli forces.
Right, and it's an interesting detail to note that it was so hard for people who had heard that he was killed to understand that it might have been staged. In other words, I would say to people, 5 options: Israelis on purpose, Israelis by accident, Palestinians by accident, Palestinians on purpose, and virtually nobody came up with staged. It was just not thinkable that that thing would have been staged. And even Esther Shapiro, who did the first documentary on it, the name of her documentary was 3 Bullets and a Dead Child. And over and over and over again, the people just assumed that Al-Dura was killed there. And when you look closely at the footage, it's clear that in the last scene, he's picking up his elbow and looking at the camera, and he's not dead. And he's certainly not dead from a stomach wound, since his hands are over his eyes. So I'll come back to that. But in any case, I'm watching the footage with Anderlin and his cameraman, his Israeli cameraman, who was with him at Ramallah the day this thing happened. And so he was seeing it for the first time too. And there are, again, all these staged scenes. And at one point, this big fat guy grabs his leg as if he's been shot in the leg and looks around, limps terribly, looks around. And at that point, other people are supposed to come pick him up and bring him to an ambulance, and off the ambulance goes. The only people who came around were little kids. They weren't going to pick this guy up. And so he shooed the kids away and walked away without a limp. And the cameraman laughed. And I said, "Why'd you laugh?" He said, "Because it seems staged." I said, "Yeah, all this stuff seems staged." And I turned to Anderlin, and Anderlin says to me, "Oh yeah, they do that all the time. It's a cultural thing." And that's when the other shoe dropped. I knew the Palestinians faked. I saw it but I didn't know that Western media had no problem with these fakes. And what they were doing was taking, sight bites and putting them together in a long string of jerky stuff that looks like action, and putting it out there as they give you the figures for how many people have been killed, how many children have been killed, all supplied by the Palestinians. So that's when, as I left the studio, I said, my God, this is an industry. And that's when I thought of the term Pallywood. Now, what's interesting is today, there are a number of articles, including a major piece in Rolling Stone. AP did a major piece referring to Paliwood, and in many cases referring to me as the coiner of the term, without consulting me. I mean, without, interviewing me on what I think about this, claiming that Paliwood is just a made-up thing. It's a conspiracy theory to deny Palestinian suffering. Okay. Alas, and I say this to the audience, please be in touch with Jonathan Greenblatt about this. The ADL came out with a piece that claimed that Paliwood was a conspiracy theory. Again, without consulting me, and I know Jonathan Greenblatt. I met with him. I spoke to some of the people at the ADL. It's not like he doesn't have access to him. So,
by the way, Jonathan Greenblatt, in a major piece today in Maariv magazine, admitted
right,
that they completely took their eyes off Hamas's, a fatal and poisoned ball, if you will, and that so there was a really a moment of self.
Well, let's hope it continues, because there's a lot. I mean, all these people. Gershon Baskin just did a piece, a letter to his bestie freedom fighter, what's his name?
In Hamas?
Yeah, Razi Hamad. And he said, oh, you're disgusting. I can't believe this. I thought you were my friend. And now I see you're calling for the extermination of Israel, etc. But, so that's a good step forward. But there's a whole lot more to do for people who have been in the peace camp and who have literally marginalized and treated as Islamophobes and right-wing warmongers anybody who warned about Palestinian malevolent intentions.
Now, how has that changed today following October 7th, in your view?
Well, we got some people who were second guessing themselves. There's a very interesting interview with Shlomi Eldar, in which he says, I think I may have misread the situation. There are a number, but not enough. And I don't think they go far enough. I don't think they really think through and go back. And rather than talk about them, I'd like to talk about CNN and how they covered the El Ahli hospital blast. Initially, it was their headline: Israeli strike kills hundreds at Palestinian hospital. Hamas, Israeli strike. Now, and let's say New York Times did the same thing. Israeli strike kills 500 people at the hospital, Palestinians say. Now, it's one thing. I mean, some people looked at this and said, well, you're trusting these people? They just massacred in the most sadistic fashion imaginable 1,400 people, and now you're taking their word on what's going on? Somebody joked, yeah, well, I mean, they may slaughter Jews, but they wouldn't lie to us. So in any case, you have this situation, and, it's one thing to cover your rear by saying, oh, Palestinians say. But the fact is, you took what they said and made it a headline. So that means you're giving it credibility and you're putting it out there. Okay. So what we have in this case, and I think it's terribly important to understand that up to this point, world sympathy, except for the moral zombies in the streets of American universities and stuff, we're siding with Israel, and we're vocally supporting Israel in a way that, we hadn't seen before, and these sort of dawning revelations, realizations that, holy mackerel, we've been wrong. And Andrew Pessin just wrote a review of my book in the Tel Aviv Review of Books called The Book That Saw 710 Coming a Mile Away. And the fact is, alas, I'm right. My kids say, you are our Cassandra, and we hate it. And I hate it too. I wish I had been wrong, but I wasn't wrong. This is really nasty stuff. It's really deep-rooted, and it goes. So there was a possibility at this point that people might actually start to rethink the whole calculus of oh, the poor Palestinians, they just want their own country, they want freedom, they want dignity, they want human rights, and the Israelis are denying it. And every time negotiations fail, whether it's with Hillary Clinton or John Kerry, it's, oh, Israel wouldn't give enough. So there was a possibility here that people might actually start to rethink. And then the Al-Ahli Hospital radically changed the scene. It radically restored the Palestinian, what I call the Palestinian grievance narrative, which we heard. It was virtually a talking point after 7/10 about, well, this didn't happen in a vacuum. And then you fill the vacuum not with genocidal teachings of Hamas. You don't fill the vacuum with what's going on in the schools and in the mosques in Palestinian areas. You fill it with the Palestinian grievance narrative. Okay, so this moment of the strike on the hospital was a really fundamental turning point in which all the shall we say credit, or all of the benefit that Israel paid for at a terrible, terrible price, it just vanished. And it restored the Palestinian grievance narrative, which is now the dominant way the media is covering everything that's going on, which is it's Israel's fault if there are Palestinians who are dying. Whereas, if you really think about it, it's quite the opposite. It's Hamas which is engineering these things. And you mentioned the thing about the shootings on the road south. There's this Palestinian Gazan kid on his bicycle with his cell phone taking pictures of the road strewn with corpses and saying, oh my God, this is a woman, this is a girl, that's a baby, oh my God, Allah, Allah. So that was immediately picked up by organizations like CARE, Committee Council for Islamic American Relations, as clearly Israeli first the Arabs who were showing this video were saying it's an airstrike. There is no sign of an airstrike. So then they said it's Israeli snipers. It's pretty clear that it's Hamas snipers who were shooting people in order to prevent them from fleeing south, because they want them up north, because they need them, as the Eretz Nehederet spoof goes, oh, I'm fine, I'm underground and Allah and 2 million Palestinians are protecting me. That's what they want. They want these deaths, and they want the West to weep over lives that they could not care less about. In fact, not only could they not care less about, the more dead, the better, the more Palestinian dead, the better for Hamas. So the hospital strike was a fascinating study. I did a piece for Quillette on the way the print media covered it, in particular the New York Times. But now I'm studying, because I've been recording CNN full-time for a while now, and this is pay dirt. I'm looking at how they covered this, and what strikes me, and I want to come back to Paliwood because everybody's been saying it's a conspiracy theory, but in fact the coverage of this event is probably the most spectacular victory of Paliwood you could ever hope for, and I'll explain. Here you have the media immediately jumping all over a story of a hospital being hit, where thousands of people had taken shelter, of hundreds, if not 500 dead. New York Times was 500, CNN was 200 to 300, but constantly, hundreds dead. That more will be discovered after they dig people out from the rubble. And that, this is just a calamitous event. Okay. And it's setting off the whole Middle East, but it's setting the Middle East ablaze. Now, what's interesting is, and I think, unfortunately, the Israelis didn't fully understand the cards that they could have played. The Israelis were intent on showing that it wasn't they who did it. But what they should have been intent on is showing that there's no way it could have been even 100 people. My guess is that we're talking about dozens, and that's the European estimate, and that's estimates of a number of other people. At most, the only pictures that we have, the picture of the most bodies that we have from Al-Ahli is about 20. And they're in the courtyard, and it's not like they're surrounded by other bodies. They're surrounded by people standing around watching. So what they didn't understand was they should have, the Israelis, the IDF should have been emphasizing, this is not only is it not us, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's not a big deal. It hit a parking lot. It didn't hit the hospital. There is no rubble. There are no hundreds of dead. This is all stuff that CNN and the others picked up from Hamas and from the doctors in the hospital who are playing the game and who are telling people about this. And they're just repeating it over and over again, literally making Hamas talking points their own. And then, and I've gotten to the point where on the next day the sun is risen, the pictures of the parking lot are available, and nobody at CNN is looking at them and saying, whoops, we got it wrong. They still have a chyron at the bottom of the screen saying hundreds believed dead, which goes on, I don't know how long into the day, but I'm interested to find out when I get to the end of my research. But what we're dealing, and what they're showing, and they continuously repeat, these are terrible images. Anderson Cooper says a horrific event, which is incidentally a Hamas talking point, horrific, comes back over and over. These images are as terrible as the event itself. And no, you look at the images and they are classic Paliwood. I'm not saying that the people in the pictures, the bodies are not dead. They are dead, but they're not hundreds. What you see is these close-up shots in the dark, jerky, out of focus, of people being taken out. This is shown in a constant loop, and this has convinced them that this is a massive strike. So that, in fact, when Mark Regev at midnight says to Jake Tapper that they didn't do it, that it was Hamas, it was a Palestinian rocket, Jake Tapper says that's an awful lot of damage for one rocket, which is what John Donison said for the BBC, which is what later on repeatedly people are saying, oh, well, we don't believe the Israelis because it's such a huge strike that, how could that be a Palestinian rocket? So what you're dealing with is a press, I call it reporting under the influence. And the influence is reporting under the influence of Hamas propaganda. They bought it hook, line, and sinker when they had to back off accusing Israel. They did, but they kept every other aspect of this story about this tragic strike. And, I'm not going to accuse them of doing this, but one of the things that they did was to keep the fire going, because anybody who thought it was Israel continued to believe that hundreds had been killed and that this was a catastrophe. And it's almost as if, like they're arsonists who are admiring the fire that they helped spread. Oh, Biden's trip is ruined. He's not going to meet with the King of Jordan. He's not going to meet with Abbas. And literally, when Rosemary Church at 10 o'clock, so by this time, already we have reports from the Australian Strategic Ministry of something or other, doing an analysis of the pictures of the scene and saying, the body count is completely implausible. Still, what they're doing, and they have the pictures from the Israeli, from the IDF, they're still talking about hundreds of dead. Their chyron is hundreds of dead believed, and what they're interested in talking about is not the revelation of what these pictures tell them. They've been talking about people, the body count rising because of digging out from the rubble. They look at the pictures, they don't talk about the fact that there's no rubble. There's no self-criticism, no reconsideration whatsoever. What do? They go to Mustafa Barghouti, they go to Khalid El-Gindi in America, they go to a woman who's in charge of care, C-A-R-E, no, C-A-R-E, in Jordan, who's reporting about this and who's talking about how terrible it is. They continue telling the story long after they have the evidence that they got it completely wrong. Daniel Canahan, in his book on thinking fast, thinking slow, argues that very often people think fast, they come to a conclusion, and when they think slow, they just work on reaffirming their initial impression. And that is a case study of these people who literally helped start the fires. Now, they can say, and even Hadass Gold, who's an Israeli in CNN, is playing the game of, oh, well, it doesn't matter who did it because, look what's happening in the Arab world. Well, it wasn't just in the Arab world. This relit the fires on campuses and in the streets of the United States and Europe. The demonstrations now could regain strength. And the people who said, yeah, but Israel, would say, oh, forget it. Now it's the Palestinians who are the victims and it's the Israelis who are the perps. So this was a disastrous, in my work and in my book, I should have brought a copy to show you, in my book called Can the Whole World Be Wrong? As one of my friends said, 500 pages of yes. In my book, I talk about lethal journalism, which is reporting your enemies, reporting in a foreign conflict, reporting one side's war propaganda as news. That was Jenin massacre, that was the Abdullah story, that was repeatedly the coverage in the previous cases in Gaza and so on. So that's lethal journalism. But lethal journalism in the case of what's going on here is also own goal war journalism. In other words, you're repeating as news your enemy's war propaganda to your own people. And that's what CNN was doing. They were undermining the president. They were undermining any kind of diplomacy, including diplomacy that was intended to help the humanitarian situation in Gaza. They didn't care. There's a kind of satisfaction. You could, I may be reading into it, but John Voss, tell me I'm wrong. There's a kind of sneer in his voice as he said, well, it doesn't matter who did it. The whole world, not the whole world, but the whole Arab world believes that it's Israel and they're not going to change their mind, which really tells you they know that once they let this stuff out, the people who want to believe it are not going to change their mind, no matter what the situation. And they went ahead and did it anyway. There's one guy, I think his name is Ben, I forget, I can look it up, but who's a specialist in disinformation, who tweeted out the headline about the Israeli strike. And when he was told to watch out by some of his colleagues, he said, no, I really think it's important for people to know that so many people died. So again, he doesn't even care who did it. What is for him, the important thing is to get out a story that's spectacular. And this is a disinformation expert who's won awards, to get out the story that's spectacular and which everybody understands a whole bunch of people who are ready to riot in the street are going to believe is Israel, no matter what Israel says. So I would say that, this is literally criminal negligence. This is, and we're not talking about people who hate Israel. I don't think Jake Tapper is a Hamas agent, but he is acting as a Hamas agent. It's almost as if he can't help himself.
He made some very strong op-ed commentary yesterday on screen in favor of objective reporting, and which came out in his reporting against Hamas.
Oh, yeah, did he report? Did he say anything about the hospital coverage?
He actually did include the hospital coverage as part of the problem, without question. I think he did do his kapara.
I look forward
all
to
but
seeing
admitting it entirely. Did say that
there's a bigger
there
problem.
Was something
here.
wrong, and there's something going on behind it.
We know, Richard. We know through our recent decades of experience with international media that frequently they serve as PR agents for the Palestinian side. That's clear. the next question is, Israel has a responsibility here
Right.
that I would suggest has not been fulfilled, has
Right.
not be, because we have known this now,
For a long
particularly
time.
for 30,
For a long
35 years. And if we're not prepared to jump on this as
Right.
a malign strategy,
Right.
we bear responsibility for
Self-destructive
falling asleep
strategy.
at the wheel.
Yeah, no, I think, for instance, when the press before they went with the story, they at least called up the Israelis and said, what do you think? And instead of saying, look, there have been shortfalls before, we don't know what happened, but it could be a shortfall. And let me recommend that even the figures on how many dead, et cetera, may be exaggerated. I would not go with this story until you find out more. We will get back to you as fast as we can. He said, we don't know, we'll get back to you, which is, an open invitation. It's like, you didn't see this coming. You didn't see Kafar Khana coming when Hezbollah was losing in Lebanon in 2006. You didn't see the hospital strike in Gaza in 2009. I mean, this is a classic piece of cognitive warfare that the Palestinians use against us, and it hasn't recorded. I mean, no offense. I mean, I tried to raise money for this. There should be a website with every single case of a shortfall rocket, with a special attention to the times that it killed kids and the faces of those kids, which appear in the New York Times on the front page with all those pictures in 2021. Of people who were killed by Hamas, and of media like Sarah Seidner, CNN, is literally commenting on this scene when she got caught red-handed doing a whole shtick about the poor, I think it was Mohammed Sadallah in 2008, I think 2009. And he was killed by Hamas rocket, and she, played it up big that it was Israel. And then when she was wrong, she sort of semi-apologized. No mention of any of this. Nobody on CNN said to her, well, you've covered this before, what's the story? It's like there is they act like a pack. CNN must have had a dozen major players here. Becky Anderson, Aaron, I forget her last name. I'm not good on names. Jake Tapper was in the States, but Anderson Cooper, you name it, Nick Robertson, Ben Wiedemann. They got a whole crew here, and they are all of one mind. It's unfortunately, it's like the university. It's like there's no conversation going on. It is just regurgitating the poor Palestinians and the enraged Israelis.
And even the romanticism of terrorism. Any type of participation by Palestinians in terror is not seen as what it should be seen as, genocidal terror, but it's seen as something as one a very famous journalist called it, participation in terror was a rite of passage for the Palestinian miners into adulthood,
right?
In a particularly
right,
disgusting and despicable.
I should say CNN doesn't go there. CNN just, Ben Wiedemann once said when President Bush was coming here, let me show you my beat, which is Palestinian suffering. So they do that. Other journalists, particularly British journalists and French journalists, do.
I think what we do have to say about the El Ali Hospital is to give a little bit of, not a little bit, even a lot of credit to the IDF spokesman for the speed at which they did debunk that whole story. It's unfortunate that they used that they're not willing to say immediately, we did not attack a hospital, because that would be almost a no-brainer to say Israel didn't attack a hospital, not intentionally, obviously. And so what I've heard also in the press is people saying, well, the IDF spokesman didn't deny X, Y, Z, which is another way of really manipulating the truth, saying, well, they didn't confirm it, but they didn't deny it. So because they said we're still checking, that is almost seen as tacit acceptance of these propaganda facts.
Right. You even have people like Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times and others who said, well, you can understand why people thought it was Israel. It's sort of like people were primed for this, and they were primed for this by the way in which the coverage goes. And they're primed for this because they don't suspect, I mean, there was another New York Times reporter, Helene Cooper, who was on MSNBC, asked about this hospital strike and so on. And she apparently didn't even realize that her newspaper had run the headline, "Israeli strike kills 500." But she said, it would be crazy to cover it like that. But at one point she was challenged on Palestinian sources say, and the person who challenged her said, this is Hamas says, not Palestinian. She says, no, it's Palestinian sources. There are witnesses. There's this and that. Nobody understands. And this gets back to Anderlein and the Al-Dura case. Anderlein used to accuse Anderlein, Larry Durfner, a whole bunch of peaceniks, used to accuse me and others who said that it was staged of a conspiracy theory. And one of the things they said is, do you think that the doctors in the hospital would be involved in a conspiracy to misinform the West? And it's like, yeah. And whether they do it on purpose, do it willingly, or they do it because they know they're going to be in trouble if they don't, doesn't fully matter. The fact is, this is not a free society, and there's a sort of an almost constitutional incapacity to absorb this.
The reason is, and I mean, this is I think we've established over the last 25 minutes that the media is not doing its job.
It's doing worse. It's doing worse than not
its Palestinian demonization of Israel. It's the media demonization.
But there's a reason here, and I think that the October 7th massacre and the November 8th today reality is a turning point and an opportunity to correct this fundamentally mistaken idea that you have two legitimate sides.
Right.
The Palestinian leadership, whether it is the Palestinian Authority, as Sandra Gerber always reminds us, we don't talk about the leadership, we talk about the Palestinian Authority, right? Because that is the Nobel Prize winning, internationally legitimized side that the governments of Israel, with their own hands and their own legitimacy, engaged in self-legitimization inversion. That is how I refer to it in the literature. They self-delegitimized. They inverted their own legitimacy and handed it to people that have never moved or changed from their declared intention of destroying the state of Israel. Now, Hamas reminded us 33 days ago what moral clarity is all about. Because by decapitating babies and burning families alive, they reminded the free world that there are not two legitimate sides. There is one legitimate side. That is the free, democratic state of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people with the dignified Muslim minority inside of Israel. The other side, frankly, in terms of moral clarity, proved themselves once again, demonstrably, as a savage, a barbarian terror organization, genocidal
and not just Hamas.
The brigade.
But even the PA, even people in the Palestinian Authority. I mean, Palestinian Media Watch covers this. Even people in the Palestinian Authority were cheering this on, and BDS, which is a civil society, nonviolent organization working for Palestinian freedom and dignity, led the charges. So-called.
And you have all of those actors playing into it: Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch,
the NGOs,
all of them playing into it, the UN observers, all of them jumping on that bandwagon, and coming with the intentional demonization of Israel, even when they know that it's
But bear in mind that Israel plays a large role in the legitimization of the Hamas.
Okay, so wait. Let me address this.
They've been dealing with this now for years, de facto.
Philippe Carsanti in France was sued by Charles Anderlein for daring to atteinte à son honneur, to a blow to his honor by questioning whether he did his job as a journalist. And what Carsanti found when he came here was he couldn't get any help. Nobody, the Israeli, the Dover Tzahal, and so on, treated Al-Dura affair as a third rail. They did not want to have anything to do with it. And I really think that, instead of there being a massive documentation available for people to look at of just how many times the Palestinians have played the world, much to the disadvantage, not just of Israel and not just of the West, but of the Palestinian people. It's a scandal that it's not there. So now what you have, and what I've seen a number of times, including a CNN reporter whose name escapes me at the moment, but I could look it up, is, her name is Clarissa Ward. So Clarissa Ward, when she's told that the Israelis didn't do it, she said, well, Israel, they have a pretty dicey record of reliability. There's the case of Shirin Abu Akleh. There's the case of, and then she raises two other vague cases, right? At no point does anybody say, well, wait a minute, up against Hamas, Israel at least admits when it's wrong. Has Hamas ever admitted when it was wrong? And how about the number of times that Hamas was wrong? And here's a list of them. Nobody even discusses Hamas. You can tell a cognitive dupe when they say Israel's credibility is questionable, and they don't. Sorry.
Do you have questions?
And they don't
I don't think
talk about.
we don't have any questions, but I have a question, just
Okay.
maybe as a takeaway for the audience.
Okay.
Are there any type of characteristics that you can say define these Pallywood events? I'll give you an example. There was a clip running around on social media of a doctor, a woman
Right.
doctor, standing at the entrance to a
yeah.
when her family or one of her children was
Right.
was,
And she
was
runs in, and the
immediately rushed
camera
in,
follows
and
her
she's
through.
and she's running through it was what was amazing to me was that the fact that the camera would
Right.
just happen to be there
Right.
in exactly the right place
And ready to
and
go.
at the right,
And ready to move.
understood the situation
Yep.
and was immediately
Right.
running down
Right.
the corridors
Right.
for that.
Right.
To me, it seemed like that whole event was
Yep.
entirely staged.
Yep.
Are there the
Yes,
characteristics,
yes.
are there common
So, for
characteristics
example,
that our audience
right.
can say, this is Pallywood, we
Right.
don't accept it?
Well, I recommend seeing my documentary called Paliwood, which is up at Vimeo, and you can access it through a website that I maintain called aldura.com. One of the things in there is that, the ambulances appear within seconds of people being injured. Well, okay, that's not reality, but it is movies. So yes, on the one hand, these issues of how likely is it that this combination of events could produce this. That's one thing. The other thing, in the case of the Al-Ahli hospital, is if you look at the clip, and I have it up at, it's available, I can make it available. If you look at the clip, and they played it over and over and over again, and they're still playing it after the Israelis have shown them that it's not a hit on the hospital. If you look at that clip, it doesn't prove any of the claims. There's no multiple bodies. There's no damage to the structure. There's no evidence in that clip. And yet you get these warnings. We're about to, warning, the pictures we're about to show you are really they're horrific. Please prepare yourself. And you get primed for it so that you see what you're supposed to see rather than looking at it. And it's hard to look dispassionately at dead bodies. So, they play the heartstrings of the West. Jeremy Bowen, who I think if they ever release the Balin report, will show up as one of the great villains of anti-Israel journalism at the BBC. He tweeted, hundreds dead or 500 dead. I forget how many hundreds he named, but he said, oh, we will never forget these people. He's already forgotten the 1400, but he'll never forget these people. It's like there was actually in the Goldstone report, came out. And one of the women who was involved, I think she was Indian, she was one of the three judges involved. And she said something like, it would be cruel not to believe Palestinian narratives of victimhood. She didn't quite put it that way. But the point is, we can't allow ourselves to be so hard-hearted that we discount these stories. And yet, when you understand how unbelievably hard-hearted the leaders of the Palestinians are in using their own people, victimizing their own people on the altar of their vendetta against Israel, then I think you can begin to understand that, you know, weeping over Palestinian dead and considering Israel responsible is literally inhumane.
It is literally killing us, as we know.
Yeah.
Whilst CNN may have retracted even part of the story, there are still millions of people out there who heard the story, haven't seen any type of other refutation, haven't heard the clear evidence, and still believe that Israel intentionally murdered 500 people in the El Hali hospital. I was asked a question like that last night on British television. Why did Israel attack the El Hali hospital? Unbelievable.
I think the answer, gentlemen, is to take what I call a no tolerance approach to this type of unprofessional and slanted, agenda-driven journalism. I think that Minister Dermer is doing an extraordinary job. If you watch his performances, his interviews on Sky, on CNN, he does not accept any of the underlying assumptions of the journalists or questions that really are, I mean, sometimes he calls them stupid questions.
Yeah, good.
And I think that is the approach that Israeli spokespeople should be taking from the government to civil society.
Let me add one more thing here. I think that, you know, just like when a baseball analogy, when a batter goes up against a pitcher, the pitcher knows what the batter's history is. He's not throwing at anybody. These guys, our spokesmen, should be going into these interviews knowing the history of the person who's interviewing them. And when they get a stupid question, they say, you know, you asked that same stupid question before and you got the answer. And why are you asking it again? Or something like that. But we need to hit back. We need to humiliate these people in front of their own audiences. They deserve it. They richly deserve it.
Well, that's what Dermer calls moral clarity in the political discourse. And I think he's absolutely right in this approach. We're going to have to cut it short here, Professor Landis, but we did really have a deep discussion about the deep problematics of the international free media and what needs to be done.
And this is tying our hands. And if we're forced, because the Arab world is on fire, to withdraw from Gaza by the United States, it will be a catastrophe for everybody, including the Arab countries that are insisting we leave.
Or into a ceasefire over a humanitarian crisis that doesn't exist either, simply because that's what America wants.
And that's what everybody's reporting.
That will appease the Arab world or the American.
We will keep bringing our friends and family and colleagues from across the sea this type of deeper analysis, context, creation and perspective from the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs. We do need your support in order to enlarge our ability to engage top experts like Professor Landis and all of the other military intelligence and diplomatic experts that we have to increase our distribution on social media. We are fighting a cognitive war, as Professor Landis has stated. Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs is playing a lead role in the cognitive warfare. Go to October 7th on Instagram and see all these counter disinformation videos that we have there. You can access them for free. We do need your financial support. $1 to $1 million is the range. It's all tax deductible. If you go onto our homepage under support, we would deeply appreciate your support. Regardless, we will be meeting you every day and enjoy having you. And we normally will take lots of questions and comments from you. We sort of run over. I think we became very enthusiastic about our own discussion today. And thank you for participating with us. Do you know who's coming? Do you know who's coming tomorrow?
Tomorrow we have Brigadier General Amir Avivi, and we're going to be discussing the whole subject of how does the IDF going to deal with the 500 kilometers of Hamas tunnels. I think we're going to have a fascinating discussion.
Brigadier General Amir Avivi is a partner of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We put on the Oslo at 30 a critical view conference with Brigadier General Avivi. He's on television all day, every day. He's the head of what they call the Bitchonistim, which are the security
Israel Defense and Security Forum.
The Israel Defense and Security Forum, which are several hundred high-ranking officers that are taking a far more a nationalistic view about Israel's national security requirements, and he's a very compelling individual. So we look forward to seeing everyone here tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I guess that would be 6 a.m. in California. But it's worth getting up and having the first espresso with us. And thank you all for joining us very much. Daniel Levin, thank you for making this all possible from the technical room here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs.